Hi, I'm Jack Baker. I'd like to talk to you about some strategies for developing and giving technical presentations. Before I get started, I should thank Professor Sabine Los. She collaborated with me on delivering this to a live audience to the Earthquake Engineering Research Institute Young Members Forum, so I appreciate her expertise and thoughts in putting this together. So to get started, I think it's useful before I start talking to you, if you think for a moment about past technical presentations you've watched. And so here I'm thinking about scientific presentations at conferences or seminars you might have heard at your company or university. And just think for a moment about some past presentations, memorable ones, and think about really memorable or good presentations where you left thinking like, I'm really glad I spent that time in that session. And think about what was it about those presentations that was memorable. I'm guessing some things just based on conversations with others in the past and my own experiences. Some characteristics that make a presentation particularly memorable is that the presenter really tried to connect with the audience. They probably told a story, both a story about what they were presenting technically, maybe a personal story that connected with the technical material. And they kept their story quite prominent and clear. What their message was very clear. Those are some typical answers. Now think for a moment about a particularly disappointing or ineffective technical presentation you might have seen. And think about what were the characteristics in those cases. Usually what I hear when I ask that question to a live audience is the presenter tried to fit too much into their presentation. Maybe they were just flying through PowerPoint slide after PowerPoint slide, trying to tell you about everything that they'd ever worked on. And it was so much that you couldn't really understand what was going on or what the message was. Sometimes it's an answer I'll hear is that somebody tried to cram too much detail in, maybe lots and lots of equations or lots of like jargon and things, and it was too hard to follow what they were saying. Another characteristic of disappointing presentations is when a speaker gets up and is just reading off of the slides. Right, they've got slides with lots and lots of text on them, and they're just reading word by word what it says on the slide to you. And so those are, I think, missed opportunities where the presenter, I'm sure, had good intentions, but they're unclear of what they're trying to get you to take away from the presentation. They're putting too much in there. They're not being careful to think about your perception and your perspective as an audience member, what might be interesting or useful to you. And there, you might have other answers as well, but I think one thing we can do before we get started on planning your own presentations is just think about what have you seen that you liked, what have you seen that you didn't like, and let's copy ideas from the good presentations and try to avoid the mistakes that made other presentations less effective. Okay, so with that in mind, and I think we'll be consistent with that thinking, I want to talk to you about a sequential planning process here. And the idea is that if you're preparing to give a talk, if you follow these big steps here one by one, it's going to set you on a path where you can really be clear about what you're trying to achieve with your work, and you're going to be very clear about what content you're going to need in that presentation to be effective and meet your objectives. Okay, so the idea is we're going to start by thinking about context. Then we're going to think about our ideas. And then only third, we're going to create the content to support that presentation. Okay. And I think this is going to work for a variety of technical presentations, from a scientific presentation again at a university or a conference, or a job interview, or maybe a pitch if you're working in a firm trying to get a job. Any of those situations, I think this type of sequential planning process can really serve you well, both in being effective and in being efficient with your preparations. So let's get started. The first thing I want you to do when you're getting ready with this presentation is here's an acronym for you. Figure out your age. So there's 3 things we need to be thinking about up front. What's the audience? What's your goal? And what's the environment you're going to be speaking in? So AGE. Right? Try to make that easy to remember. So first, let's talk about audience. What you want to think about is what are the characteristics of this audience you're going to be speaking to? And that's going to help you think about what are their motivations? What is their background? What are they going to know and believe already? What do you need to try to teach them or convince them of? And so, having that audience in mind is really important. Something that I think that can help with this is to even think about specific people or specific job titles, right? So if you're going to a scientific conference, you might say, okay, well, it's scientists or engineers. That's too general, too vague to really help you with your planning. If you can think about, maybe a colleague who you think would be present in the room and might be, typical of the background or perspective of somebody who's in that room. That can really help you get specific and think about, what is that person's motivations and knowledge. All right. If you can't think of a specific person, you could think about a job title, right? Is this, graduate students in civil engineering or something like that? Okay, so we want to know who that audience is, because that's going to inform what are we trying to tell them, how are we going to be effective in telling them our message. Next thing you want to think about is, what's your goal? You're going to get up in front of people, you're going to take some of their time, take some of their attention, and you want to have in mind what you're trying to get out of that, right? If you don't really know where you're going, then the audience isn't going to know either, and it'll be a missed opportunity with that time that you all have spent together. And so I've got some ideas here on the side, some potential goals, right? You could be motivating action, right? Are you trying to get people to adopt a policy you're recommending? Are you trying to encourage them to utilize a tool that you've developed, or utilize a way of thinking about a problem that you've developed, right? So you want them to actually, use something afterwards or do something afterwards. You could be trying to teach a concept, right? This is common in a teaching environment, classroom environment, that you want the audience to understand this concept you're explaining, but also you want them to be able to apply it, right? So they need to be able to utilize the concept themselves. That's a different level of detail required than if you just want them to know about the concept, but maybe not actually, execute it themselves. So that, the goal is going to influence how much detail you need to go into and what type of background and information you need to present. Another goal could be to sell yourself, right? If you're going into a job interview where you're giving a technical presentation as part of the interview, the goal is that they hire you, they give you the job offer afterwards. And so then you can think about, well, what do I need to do? Coming to the next steps, what do I need to do to sell myself? So all of those are potential goals. It's going to vary from situation to situation, but it's good to have in mind what you're hoping to get out of that time at this stage. Okay, so we got an audience in mind. We've got this goal. Then we want to think about the speaking environment. So there's a variety of things that are helpful here to understand what's this environment we're going to be in. So first of all, you need to know the duration of the presentation, right? Is it a 15-minute presentation or a 60-minute presentation? That obviously has big impact on your planning. You want to know about the physical space you're going to be in and the equipment, and the audience size is kind of related to that. So a lot of times for technical presentations, you'll have a presentation screen. It could be a television or a projector screen or something like that. You might, and so you want to think about, do you have that? Do you have audio projection ability? Are you going to be on a microphone? Or are you going to be just speaking yourself? If you have some sort of video with audio playing out of it, is there ability in the space to play that? Things like that. And also, you might think about, are the audience members going to be seated facing you? Are they going to be seated around tables? Are they going to be seated or standing? Those types of things can be helpful to understand ahead of time. Got a couple photos here of, you might give the same type of presentation in a small conference room where everybody's around a small table. Or you might be in a much bigger space where there's a spread out people. You can't have them all in your eyesight. You can't make eye contact with all of them. That's helpful to understand. Another thing that I think is really helpful to think about with a speaking environment is, what's the schedule of events that the audience is going through, right? So in a scientific conference, it's not unusual that you might be giving a presentation that's one of, say 6 in an hour-and-a-half session. And the audience members are all going to be going from session to session all day. They might hear 20 presentations in a given day. That has that's a very different feeling than if you're going and giving, a presentation during a work day at a company, and you might be the only presentation that the people will hear that day. It just makes a difference in terms of how much attention the audience members are focusing on you, how much information they're pulling in that's kind of similar to yours that day. If you're speaking in a series of talks at a scientific conference, other speakers before and after you might be providing background on the topic that you then don't have to provide in your presentation. Or that would be redundant if you provided it again. So it's helpful to just put yourself in the shoes of those audience members and think about, what's that environment they're going to be in. So try to get as much clarity as you can here, right? A lot of times when you're invited to give a presentation, people will tell you, oh, you have a 45-minute presentation and to our staff in the, such and such group. But if you can ask a couple more questions of, is there a projector available? Is there, if you need any sort of special considerations, is that possible? Try to get as much, information as you can. It'll help you be effective in the space, and it can sometimes help a little bit with nerves as well if you're not surprised by some characteristic of the speaking environment when you get there. Okay, so we've got our age, our audience, our goal, and our environment. Now we need to think about our ideas a little bit. And many folks listening, if you're an engineer or scientist, you might be very practiced with using PowerPoint or other types of presentation software. And you might want to go start making slides. Right? You've got lots of results to talk about. You can start putting those into slides and making them look nice. Really resist that temptation. Don't be getting up this slide deck like I've got shown on the right. Think first about your ideas, right? If you think too much about your slides, number one, you can spend a lot of time fixing up slides that you actually don't end up needing. The other is that you can let those slides kind of dictate what your message is, rather than you first thinking about your message and then putting together the slides that are going to support that. So I really encourage, write your conclusions first. And actually you can start working on your conclusion slide if you want, just don't work on the other slides. But really think about, like, what are you trying to leave the audience with? What do you want them to conclude? What do you want them to leave your presentation thinking about? And then you can think about, well, what am I going to need to provide in terms of evidence to support those conclusions? Do I need some results from work that I've done? Right? If I'm trying to convince the audience to use a new scientific technique I've developed, I want to show some results from that technique, perhaps, to motivate why it's useful. Maybe I want to illustrate that it's not a very hard technique. If my goal is to get a job for my company, I'm trying to pitch for a project, maybe I want to show results from past projects that are similar to show that my ability to deliver what I'm saying is possible. Right? So what are those results going to be that are going to support your conclusions? You may need some background, right? As in a technical presentation, there might be some methods you're using or some ideas that are important for background. I'd really encourage you to not put a whole lot of background at the start of the presentation before you get into your results, but really try to provide that background kind of right as you need it inside the results. And the thinking is that if somebody sits down and listens to you at a presentation and there's 5 or 10 minutes of background at the start before you get into new things, the audience doesn't understand where you're going with that. They don't understand what they need to take away from that background information. And so it's hard for them to pull out the most important bits of it. It's also, if you give the background very early, and then it's a while until it's needed, they'll have forgotten some of those ideas, or they'll have a hard time kind of keeping that all in their memory. And finally, they can just get bored if it's just background to start a presentation, that you kind of lose the goodwill of the audience that's there to pay attention to you. And so if you can just get into your results quickly, and then along the way say, oh, by the way, here's a little bit of background information to explain why we're doing this, that often works really well. And then here's an important concept that's a really cool trick, is to avoid interesting but irrelevant content. So when I'm working with my students, this is very frequently the case, that they've got something really cool that they worked on, a really interesting result. So they put it in the slides, right? Because it's a cool thing and they spend a lot of time on it, but it doesn't support the conclusions, right? And so the problem is that then you get this kind of meandering story, and it's hard for the audience to understand, why they're hearing certain things. Or you pack the presentation with so many of these interesting but irrelevant things that they lose the key messages, and there's just this kind of flood of all of these different ideas, and they don't leave with kind of a big picture understanding of what you were trying to present. So just because you take something out of your presentation doesn't mean it's not interesting. It just means it's not relevant to your conclusions here. So be really careful about those kind of side stories and things like that. It's tough for an audience to follow along with you. Okay, so those are some things to be thinking about, just getting that story together, right? And by the end of this, you want to think about kind of key conclusions, key results that you're going to present to support that, and kind of some background maybe you can sprinkle in along the way to make sure that they're staying with you and they're not getting lost on some sort of technical idea. Okay, so now you can start putting together slides. I've got other content to slides that I'll link to in the show notes, but here's one high-level idea that I want to suggest to you, which is that you use assertion-evidence style slides when you're putting together your results. And so the idea here is I tried to give you a bit of a structure here on this slide, but the title of your slide is going to make a statement. It's going to make an assertion. And so and the title of the slide, conversely, it's not going to just say the topic, right? So traditionally, some folks might take a slide like this and title it assertion-evidence style slides or assertion-evidence slides. But if you don't make an assertion, the audience doesn't really know what to do with that topic. They're not sure, are you recommending something? Are you giving a warning about something? Are you evaluating something? And so if you make an assertion and say, use these slides, it's much easier for the audience to understand what you're saying. And then below that title, you're going to provide some evidence for that assertion, right? So if it's a technical presentation, you might have some results from an experiment or something like that. and you can show those results on the slide to help justify why you're making that assertion. Okay? So the idea is to have those results to support the assertion in this kind of little mini story that you're telling on the slide. And then you're going to use complete sentences to provide that evidence or to make statements as well. So you don't want to work with just little sentence fragments. Again, it's really hard for the audience to process those, and it's harder to comprehend. So when you work with these complete sentences, make an assertion, provide the evidence, it's really easy for the audience to follow along with your story and understand what you're doing and what you're trying to tell them. So let's contrast that with traditional slide formats, right? So PowerPoint really encourages us by default to just use these outline structures. And if you don't think about it, you can fall into using these sentence fragments. And so look what happens here if I've got a slide like this. Right. So first, the title is just a topic, just traditional slide formats. It doesn't tell the audience, am I recommending traditional slide formats? Am I telling them to avoid traditional slide formats? Am I asking questions about traditional slide formats? You just can't tell without an assertion. And then these bullet point outlines, right? PowerPoint makes it very easy to have these indented outlines and lots of points on a list, but it's really hard to read those, and it takes a lot of energy to both process all those words and then try to put some structure to it, right? Is that am I making some sort of an argument here, or am I giving a list of related ideas? How do the different points relate to each other? It's really hard to sort that out, and you're used to doing it a lot. You've seen a lot of slides like this, and so you might not, complain adamantly when you see something like this, but it's really hard. And when you compare it to the experience of looking at an assertion evidence style slide, it's pretty incredible how much easier it is to take the information away from that assertion evidence style slide and to really understand what the speaker is trying to say. So when you're the speaker, you're trying to make it as easy as possible on the audience to have the outcome you're hoping for, whether it's, again, motivate action or share some idea, teach some idea. And the more you can make that easy for them, the more likely you are to succeed with your goals. Okay, so once you've kind of laid things out, you've got your message, you've got your conclusions, you've set up some slides, you've got the assertion evidence style. I'll mention briefly just some slide format points. This isn't a major topic of the presentation, but as long as we're preparing the presentation, I want to just alert you kind of when to do this. So you do this at the very end. You've got everything kind of laid out first. Now you can play with your formats a little bit. So some things to do. I'd suggest putting slide numbers on your slides always. You've probably been in a presentation where somebody gave a talk and then there was a question from the audience and they said, oh, could you go back to that section where you talked about, X? Oh, could you go back a little further? No, that's too far. Can you go forward? And it's this kind of painful thing of trying to sort out where this piece of information was that the member wants to ask a question about. If you just put little slide numbers in the corner of your slides, it's much easier for the audience member to make a note when they're listening to you and say later, could you go back to slide 10? I had a question about that. So you see I've got slide numbers on these slides. It's very unobtrusive up in the corner. It's just built into my templates that I use. That really works well. I'd suggest as well, go back through your slides and check for any acronyms and any jargon. So you're probably an expert in your field. You've been maybe working months or years on some topic. And so some acronym, may be very natural to you. But anytime you get an audience member that doesn't know that acronym, they're going to immediately quit listening to you, stare at that acronym, try to figure out what it means, figure out what you're talking about. And you've lost their attention for the moment. And that's really hard. Same thing with jargon. If there's technical words, again, think back to your audience. Think about, are they likely to know what that word means? Even if some of them are and some of them aren't, err on the side of either explaining what you're talking about with a definition or just trying to use a word that's not too jargony. That'll really help a lot. Again, with making it easy for the audience to hear your message and not get distracted by these unintentional mess ups. I think these acronyms and jargon, that's probably another place, thinking back to the start of this presentation when I said, think about a presentation where you really felt it was not effective. Heavy use of symbols, acronyms, jargon, that's a common situation where you really feel like uninspired by a presentation. All right, moving on. In terms of your fonts, so keep things, my message would be keep things simple and keep focused on ease of reading. So you want to use relatively large font sizes, make them pretty easy to read, even at low resolution, right? You might be on a projector, using a projector that's not super high resolution or super clear, and you don't want to have that interfere with your message. Use these sans serif fonts. I think ideally serif fonts are good for reading out of books when you're trying to read a lot of text along a line. In a presentation with not too many words, you don't need those serifs. Use maybe two colors, maybe two sizes, right? That's what I've got here on this template. with kind of larger red titles and then black body text. That's enough. If you've got lots of fonts and lots of colors and lots of font sizes, it's just distracting. It's harder for the audience to hear what your message is. And then in terms of general layout, I really suggest using a white background with dark text on it. That's if the lights are on in a room where you're working. This gets back to your environment. It's a little easier to read a white screen with dark text. In a darkened room, dark with white text can work okay. But I've got the photo of Steve Jobs. He kind of popularized this aesthetic of these kind of dark screens with light text. It's nice if you've got people to put together a good presentation for you, and it's nice if you've got a very beautiful space to present in, like Steve Jobs used to. But if you're unsure of your environment, it can be a little tricky. It can also be a little tricky that if you've got figures and things you want to show, and you're using a black background, that means you have to produce figures with a black background and a light text, and that can be an extra step sometimes depending on what software you're using for your figures. So as a general rule, I really prefer to just use the light backgrounds and just kind of keep with a nice simple template like I've got shown here. Okay, so let's start wrapping up here. Conclusions, again, try to use complete sentences and tell the audience what you want them to take away. So my first thought for you is just that this process, right, I've got this kind of systematic process, again, summarized over on the right. Start with your context, get that age, the audience, goal, and environment. Next, think about your ideas. So what's the message you're trying to convey? What are some key results you're going to need to present to convey that message or support your conclusions? And then once you've done that, you can spend some time working on the content. Our instinct is to go with content first, I think, for many people. But you then spend a bunch of time creating content that may or may not be serving your goals. And it's both stressful because it's hard to kind of put together what you need, but it's also less efficient. If you don't know where you're trying to get to, it's harder to get there. So I think this is an efficient strategy in terms of minimizing the amount of time and effort it takes to put together a presentation. It's also effective in that you can be confident that in the end, you've got a presentation prepared that's going to help you achieve your goals. And I think, my sense in talking with people who I've presented this to before is that these are not controversial ideas. I don't think there's a lot of argument that it's a bad idea to think about what your goal is, or that, having a clear illustration of your message is, those are not controversial ideas. They're just not intuitive. And so if you haven't been trained in these types of ideas, maybe you hadn't thought about it before, but hopefully on reflection, you're feeling like that's a reasonable way to go. And then a final message here is that my colleague Sabine Los and I put together a little handout with some checklists of things to go through. So we hit some of the high-level ideas here for preparations. There's some additional items on the checklist to think through as you're preparing a presentation. If you look at this QR code, and I'll provide a link as well, just a little 2-page handout that's got some key ideas. If you've got that handy next to you while you're putting together your presentation, hopefully that'll keep you on track for, again, an efficient and an effective preparation of your presentations. So I wish you all luck with your presentations, and I hope to see some effective presentations from some of you out there in the future. Thanks. Bye.